What is up, everybody? Welcome back into Shout. The Super Bowl is now in the rearview mirror, and it's time to fully embrace the offseason. And the Buffalo Bills have a lot of work to do. We're going to get into kind of the path that Brandon Beane may take this offseason, what needs to be done, what should be done. And I brought in my good buddy, Joe Buscaglia from The Athletic. What's up, my friend?
What's going on, Matt? I feel like I just left you.
I know,
but
it's been
also,
too long already.
I know, but also it feels like it's been a year since the season ended. So I think that's just a proper okay, you all needed this. you all needed some time.
Yes, and to explain it to people, like the NFL season for reporters, it's such a grind, and the deeper you go into the playoffs, the team that you cover, I feel like the exhaustion level ratchets up so high, and then it's like this complete energy dump on the other side of it. The week after, I didn't really leave my couch.
I don't blame you. I mean, I'm trying to remember. I think I wrote a couple of off-season things, but mostly it was like, okay, time to catch up on some sleep, time to hang out with the little man, time to do just about everything that you can't do during the season. And it's not like a complaining thing. It's like okay, you've worked so hard all throughout the year. Once you get to the off-season, it's kind of like the reward because it's like, okay, well, still the business picks up because the team has to figure out their stuff. But also from a reporter point of view, it's like, okay, well, you don't have to be there every single day on every single second of every single minute. So yeah, it is a nice little log off factor.
So I don't have a specific plan for this episode. I just wanted to kind of have a conversation about where the team is, watching the Super Bowl, what your impressions are of what happened there, and then kind of punt this thing down the field a little bit and see what has to happen over the next couple of months for the Bills to maximize things for the 2025 season. And I mean, don't look now, but like Josh Allen is what is going to be 29 next year. Let me bring this up. 29.
Yeah, 29 in April, I think it is.
29 in April. So in May. It'll be 29 in May. That's pretty good. That's better than me. So we're creeping into years of the prime now, right? Like we're starting to, I don't want to say push the panic button, but every year that goes by without a Super Bowl, the more I feel pressure continues to mount on this regime, Allen, the whole deal. So we'll get into a lot of those different conversations in this episode. Before we do, though, we're brought to you by Tops Friendly Markets. And right now, it is a wonderland of freezer savings at Tops. Find the coolest way to save this season at Tops. From now through March 1st, every $40 you spend on participating brands earns you $10 back. Fill your freezer with family favorites and earn big rewards while you shop. The more you stock up, the more you save. Okay, so big picture. We're 2.5 weeks out from the loss to the Chiefs in Kansas City. What's been like the prevailing thought in your mind as to why that result occurred?
Well, how much time do we have? No, there's a lot to what happened in that game. I know the easy part of it is, they couldn't get pressure on Mahomes and they couldn't stop Mahomes and all these other things, and that's going to be the thing that sticks in people's brains. And that could be the way that the Bills approach the offseason. But I think taking the entire viewpoint of where they were good and where they were not so good and kind of what identities they were forced to take because of personnel, I think it might lend itself to a bit of a bigger picture equation, because you can look at that game and be like, oh, Mahomes got 30 points for the first time the entire season. What is this defense doing? But at the same time, I look over on the offensive side of things, and this is not a blame game on Josh Allen by any means, but when the offense is so limited in what they can call, I just think it almost did their offense a bit of a disservice, because this was the best offensive line, the best running game they've ever had with Josh Allen, and that balance they were looking for, and almost like bailed them out a lot of times throughout the year. The balance that they're looking for almost wasn't there to the other side of things. Like, we're so used to them being this pass friendly unit where they're just lighting up the scoreboard, lighting up points, lighting up passing yards and everything along those lines. And they were still there. They had their moments, but I think what that Chiefs game really unveiled for me is just kind of like a confirmation throughout the year. They just didn't have the guns at wide receiver, I don't think. And that was even with Amari Cooper. I mean, how many times, actually, I know the number, but the amount of times that Joe Brady was forced to call a screen to the boundary because it worked on the first play. I think they called it either 6 or 7 times throughout the game, which is a lot. And that to me just lends itself to, you're not getting separation down the field. You're trying to generate offense, however you can through the passing game. And so when you look at how he was forced to call that game because of the personnel that they had, it just lent itself to me like, okay, if you are going to get where you need to go, you're going to need that full-scale offense, because the defense is so fleeting year after year. We say it every single season, every single offseason. You don't know what is going to happen on defense because it's such a collection of 11 guys, and sometimes the ball bounces their way, sometimes the ball doesn't bounce their way. And there are certain things you can get to help yield better results year to year. But I just think being able to go out there and have a player who can separate on the intermediate to deep area, it would do wonders for this offense. And it's not anyone that they have on the roster right now. Like Kincaid, I think he'll have a better year next year because he was banged up near the end of the year, but he's more of an intermediate target. Shakir is a short to intermediate guy. And then the rest of their receiver group, Keon Coleman, I mean, he's not really a deep field separator. He's more of a short field separator than anything. So they need an intermediate to deep separator, someone who can come in at that Z receiver role and maybe even become their eventual number one in the offense. So, yeah, I think that's what it really unveiled to me more than anything. And I do want to be careful because they did score 29 points, but at the same time, I do think that Joe Brady was almost working with kind of like a hand tied behind his back because they just weren't able to separate down the field.
I have a lot of defensive thoughts. We'll get there in a minute, but I want to stay here on offense because I think you make a really good point. And I think that what we also saw kind of reveal itself in the Super Bowl was a team with a quarterback that I don't think anybody would argue is on the level of Josh Allen, but can do a lot of similar things. When he is accurate, I feel like he kind of levels up a bit. But what does he have at his disposal? 2 of the elite outside boundary receivers in the game, in A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. I think that they're like a perfect kind of trait or characteristic set, like how they complement each other so well. And I think I agree with you. And you look at Keon Coleman and bringing him into this offense, I think he can be a piece to what they do long term. But I look back at a team that's been so aggressive trading up year after year, Kyrie Elam, Dalton Kincaid, and it felt like for a while there in the teens that Brian Thomas Jr. was absolutely standing out on that board. And to me, he would have been like maybe the piece that you get aggressive and go up and get. And I wonder how much Brandon Beane is going to learn from all of these different hits and misses over the years. Because let's not, for as much as we could criticize him early in drafts, what he's done on day 2 and day 3 over the course of his time here has been one of the best GMs in the league in that department, in my opinion. But what I think he needs to do is be a little bit more, rather than be in the moment, searching for a specific position. It felt like they needed to get receiver at that spot. It felt like for whatever reason, that was the organizational approach. When they drafted Elam, it was like, we're not coming out of that first round without a cornerback. And I think that kind of puts you in a spot where, sure, you can get a potential first round level talent, but is that necessarily the right fit for what you want to do on offense or defense? And I also look on the defensive side of the ball. We'll get to this in a second. I have big issues with the way that they've lacked aggressiveness building the defensive line in the draft on day 2 and day 3, really since Harrison Phillips. I mean, Harrison Phillips was the last interior defensive lineman they drafted in the middle rounds until Dwayne Carter this last year. And to me, You look at some of these other teams, the Eagles, the Chiefs that have been at the top and have built through the draft their defensive lines. They're throwing darts every year, sometimes multiple darts.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you on the defensive line standpoint, but I do want to go to like the first round discussion. They definitely telegraphed what they were going to do in the Kaiir Elam year. Like everybody knew they needed a cornerback. The Chiefs knew they needed a cornerback. So the fact that the Chiefs were able to move up beyond where the Bills were, because the Bills were, I don't want to say they got cute with it, but they got borderline cute with it in waiting for their guy. And Brandon Beane, who has been super aggressive throughout his first 5 drafts, has not really done that as much in the last few years. And I do wonder if part of him wonders, man, if I was just a little bit more aggressive on draft day. And some of this has to do with draft capital, not having a ton of it over the last couple of drafts. This year is different. So I do wonder if maybe they do try to get a little bit more aggressive in this upcoming draft, because by the time compensatory picks come out, they should land 10 picks overall. They have 8 right now. And I think over the cap projects them as getting 2 5th-rounders, 1 for Leonard Floyd and 1 for Gabriel Davis. So that's not nothing. Like 6th-round picks, meh. 5th-round picks are where teams start to go, okay, I'm listening a little bit. If you throw an extra 5th in there, it kind of like turns their heads a little bit. I wonder if because they have some of that ammo and they don't have as many spots that they can put on the roster right away. I do wonder if maybe this is the year that they start to go after it a little bit more, as they had in previous seasons. But there's no debate. They need to be better in the first round. And I'm not out on Kincaid yet. I think right. Kincaid can have a comeback year next year. Elam, I mean, you've talked to me for a lot of years. I was not impressed by Kaiir Elam pretty much right away. And I think the way that it's kind of unfolded has been a complete miss, and probably the worst miss of Brandon Beane's first round tenure so far. And part of that had to do with, because what you pointed out, like it was kind of telegraphed. Everybody knew that they needed a cornerback. He felt like he needed to come out of that draft with a cornerback. But just because you need a cornerback doesn't mean you need to take it with your first pick. I think there's a certain amount of need meets value here. And for as much as we hear Brandon Beane throughout the years talk about how, they're not going to force a pick if the grade doesn't match the player, but that one kind of felt like it a little bit. So I think that's staying true to those values needs to be upheld a bit more. And, I think this is a much smaller scale because millions of dollars aren't thrown around. But I think we've all kind of been there in like random fantasy football drafts and stuff where it's like the guy you want is off the board and you make this brain dead decision and you're like, I wish I didn't do that. But, you live and you learn. And I think that's a live and learn moment for Brandon Beane to a higher scale.
So it's hard to kind of completely discuss this point because I think there was a little bit of, it was very early, I believe, in the Ken Dorsey era when they drafted Dalton Kincaid. This was the first offseason for Joe Brady, and you could maybe argue that the Curtis Samuel addition that I think Brady really wanted was a bit of a miss. I do think that there's potential for him to be a little bit more involved and bigger part of the offense if he can stay healthy, but that's a big question at his size and the way that he plays. But how much do you think the Bills have to reevaluate how they go into drafts when it comes to the synergy between the coaching staff and the front office with drafting a player and then how they're going to use them on the other side of things? Because to me, it felt like Kaiir Elam was a complete scheme misfit from the start. Like it didn't feel like he necessarily fit into what Sean McDermott and company want to do on defense. And nothing was more evident than a 6th-round pick who from everything I've heard, McDermott had done a little bit more work on him, knew more about him for whatever reason. It was a little bit easier for him to kind of fit into this thing right away. And then you think They draft Dalton Kincaid, they move up to get him, and they never have a really good plan for deploying 2 tight ends and running this 2 tight end system. How much of that for a regime that has a coaching staff and front office that have been so aligned in so many ways, it feels like the plan for draft picks sometimes is where it's the biggest miss for me. And then the usage of those draft picks after the fact. Sometimes I feel like on the coaching side, you just have to kind of lean into the fact that this was a first-round draft pick. You're going to have to figure out a little bit sooner if the kid can play or not.
Yeah, and there is a certain amount to that. On the flip side, if they did the same thing with like a Cole Bishop at the beginning of the year last year, I think that would have been an unmitigated disaster early on in the season, looking back on things, because, look no further than the Texans game. He was not ready at the start of that game. He got better as it went on, but those bad moments were pretty evident, and he got much better near the end of the year. From the synergy standpoint, having a plan for that player and having everyone on board, and not to say that Sean McDermott wasn't on board with Kaiir Elam. I think everybody in that building wanted Elam to work. And you can easily sell yourself on that type of guy because, great measurables. He gives you the potential man coverage piece, so that way you can be a bit more multiple in how you defend, maybe think about sending blitzers. But at the end, they've just stayed true completely to who they are as a defensive scheme, which is they're not going to blitz a ton. And if they're playing a bunch of man coverage and blitzing, it's usually as a last-ditch effort to try and salvage a game because their zone is just not up to snuff against a really good quarterback. And we saw that the last 2 playoff games where they went heavy into man. It worked against the Ravens. It did not work at all against the Chiefs. And the Chiefs were ready for that pivot point. And that's something that maybe Bobby Babich needs to grow from, or they just need a bit more better defensive personnel there. So the synergy point is important. The Kincaid pick, if they had really committed to the 11.5 personnel that Brandon Beane talked about when they first drafted him, I think there was potential for it to live up to that, live up to how high they picked him. But there are a few things standing in the way now. One is Khalil Shakir and how he has improved over the last 2 seasons to where he has to be on the field on 11 personnel. You're not going to sub out Shakir because they view him as a slot receiver pretty much only. And that's what, they would have changed it around. If there was a year that to move him around, it would have been last year. And they just didn't. He was mostly a slot guy. So I would anticipate that's his role moving forward. And the other part of it is Kincaid can't keep himself on the field for all downs because he's a really bad blocker. And that's, I think, a piece of it that is preventing him from realizing his potential, because when he goes out on the field, usually it's pretty obvious that they're going to pass the ball. Now, occasionally they'll trot him out there on 13 personnel. They'll trot him out there on 12 personnel. But it was very obvious and telling to me that when Kincaid was brought up to both Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott after the season had ended, the verbiage they used in different press conferences, mind you, was he needs to get stronger, which is code word for he needs to frickin' learn how to block and get better at it. Because when you have this asset, this receiving asset, the only way he's getting on the field and staying out there for the amount of snaps that fans and fantasy football players want him to is if he offers enough flexibility to allow them to do so. Tight end, you have to do a little bit of everything. So I think that was a bit of the misfire on that, not thinking that maybe he could come in and be a bit of a better blocker. So this is big on Kincaid to get stronger. It's big on Rob Boris, the tight ends coach, to help develop him as a blocker. Maybe he goes and chats with Aaron Cromer a little bit and works with him a little bit, whatever it takes. But that's his path to being on the field more and to finally supplanting Dawson Knox on the field. But I'll tell you this, if there was momentum for Kincaid to get on the field more this time last year, there absolutely was. that momentum is basically halted a bit because of how much they just doubled down on their love for Dawson Knox and what he means to the locker room, and how much he's able to do from both a blocking perspective and from a receiving perspective.
That is a very expensive love affair to have at this point with Dawson Knox, who is,
but they can't cut him.
I know
they can't cut him.
You're stuck in a situation that of your own doing, and you're right, that extension. Looking back at it, and listen, I think Dawson Knox, for everything that he does in the community, the leadership piece, honestly, at his best moments, he's been a really good, serviceable, solid player for them. It hasn't been consistently as good as you'd probably like, but I think a lot of that popped up when they brought in Kincaid. Do you think that's one of the bigger missteps for Beane in giving Knox that extension? Because even at his peak, pre-extension, I don't think he was ever a $14 million tight end.
No, he was a better receiver, and he did have a pop year. But it's really a difficult thing because he's so important to the locker room, and he's so important to Josh Allen. Like, those two guys are bros. And that's not to say that's the only reason that he got paid, but these are all contributing factors to getting him to that point. I think this whole discussion would have been avoided had they just traded up for Jordan Addison a couple of years ago. And Addison is a player you could tell on tape when you were watching him before that draft. Like that, and they probably knew that there was a run on receivers coming. Who would it start? I think it started with Jackson Smith and Jigba in Seattle, and then it went to Quentin Johnson. The fact that they didn't move up for it was Zay Flowers. You're right. The fact that they didn't move up for one of Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison was a little mind blowing to me, only because you could kind of see that they were going to need to refresh the receiver room, and their pivot to that was, okay, forget receiver. Let's go with a tight end to give ourselves a more dynamic look, which is good in theory. But until you are able to execute those things, then it falls a little short. And because they paid Dawson Knox and they drafted Dalton Kincaid, they've worked themselves into a spot where you're going to be misusing an asset one way or the other, unless you play them both together. And they have quite clearly shown the lack of want to play those two together since the first few weeks of the 2023 season. So yeah, I'm with you. I think it would have been much more in their interest to draft Jordan Addison a couple of years ago and to, give up whatever extra pick it would have taken. I mean, they traded up for Dalton Kincaid, so they were in the market. I think it was just, to me, that was them thinking that this was the next thing, the next shape of their offense. And I'm not criticizing them for trying to go outside the box on it. It's just, you were so good at 11 personnel. Josh Allen is so good with 11 personnel. Dawson Knox has that contract. He's serviceable, if not more. How much would Jordan Addison have helped this team this past year? And the answer to that is probably quite a bit.
So I want to get into the defensive line, and I want to kind of do a deep dive, and I want to start with, before we get to the personnel and the draft and the approach to reshaping these two rooms, the defensive tackle and defensive end room. I want to talk about like the scheme, but also to a deeper level, how the Bills have kind of failed to develop talent for the most part, outside of Greg Rousseau. And I think you can put Ed Oliver in there as well. I think they've done a pretty good job developing him. Although in the playoffs, I think that you're just looking for more of an impact across the board. We'll get to all of that. So the Bills are reportedly hiring Jason Rabrovich as their assistant O-line coach. Who is the assistant D-line coach that reportedly they're bringing in?
Gosh,
do you know off the top of your head?
No, I don't.
It was reported. I think it is Rabrovich, actually. He's not the offensive.
Jason Rabrovich? No, you're right.
He's
and
the defensive line coach.
Rebrovich was in Buffalo before, by the way.
What years?
He was the Marone staff, I believe.
Oh wow, throwback city.
Time's a flat circle, baby.
And then they're reportedly also bringing in former defensive coordinator for the Falcons and Jags, I believe, Ryan Nielsen.
Yeah,
and then Brian Pellegrino, I believe, the cornerbacks coach from the Patriots. We'll talk about him in a minute. What I sense here is that it is a aggressive move to try to get an uptick on the coaching side in terms of development, because Nielsen is much heralded for his ability to develop talent on that Saints defensive line, probably about 6 to 8 years ago. I think he was on Sean Payton's staff there and did a pretty good job in that department. I think that's one of the things that you could sit here and you could take a swing for Myles Garrett. You can draft a bunch of players upcoming in April, and I think they should. But if you're not getting it done, developing these pieces that you supposedly have a vision for, I think that's been one of the bigger problems is they haven't found their Aaron Kromer for the defensive line. And I don't know if that necessarily is Nielsen or Rebrovich, or if Marcus West is going to be a guy that really starts to develop some talent here. But to me, that's a piece that it has to happen, especially if you're going to go deep at D-line in this April's draft.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you on the development of defensive linemen. It is rang hollow throughout their tenure, and that's been one of their biggest misses throughout the entire time. I mean, Rousseau is a really good player. Is he the high ceiling 15 to 16 sack a season guy? And his pressure rate is there, so I don't want to say that. But is he a closer? And that's a big part of the deal too. Like, he goes through these moments where it's like, whoa, Rousseau took over that game. But there's also times where he kind of, fades into the background a bit. And this is now heading into his 5th season. So who is he? Are you willing to pay $25 million plus to keep Greg Rousseau around? I believe that Rousseau, and I know this is not your question, and I just want to bring this up before I get to the other thing. I believe Greg Rousseau is kind of in the Tremaine Edmonds conversation. Like, similar guys, similar production, height, weight. Can you believe how young he is? Like, the whole piece is there from both these guys. Edmonds got absolutely paid on the open market. If Rousseau even gets a sniff of that, he's equally going to get absolutely paid on the open market, especially if he hits double digits this upcoming year. So that's a piece of it. I do think they have done Rousseau a bit of a disservice in moving him around the last couple of years from left to right side. I was pretty much a broken record for a solid 2 months of this season, saying they need to rush Rousseau only from the left side. He's so much better on that side, and he was getting results from that side. And when Von Miller was suspended, Rousseau had a major uptick. I'm like, this cannot change. They can't go back to what they were doing. What did they do? They went back to what they were doing. They shifted Rousseau over to the right side on 3rd downs. Von Miller would come in, and I guess he was fine. But still, I mean, Rousseau is the guy for your defensive line room. I also found it interesting that Epinesa basically didn't play 3rd downs at all this season. And that's a major miss there, because they brought him back to be the starter, but he was on 1st and 2nd downs only for the most part. They would either bring in Rousseau and to go on the right side. Von Miller would come in on the left side. Dwayne Smoot would come in at defensive tackle. Epinesa was not on the field. So and his pressure rate this year was abysmal comparatively to the rest of the NFL. Like, he was under 5% of a pressure rate. So this is all builds to the bigger point, because these are 2 draft guys that they've had. And think back, I mean, Boogie Basham is the other defensive end that they drafted. They haven't really done it all that much. Javon Solomon showed some promise in last year's training camp and in garbage time, but he is a liability against the run right now. So you can't really put him out there all that much. The investment in the defensive line has to be there uniformly. They've done it at 3-technique defensive tackle. They haven't done it at 1-technique defensive tackle since Harrison Phillips, and I know you mentioned him. Defensive end, they haven't done it since Greg Rousseau, at least substantially. Mm-hmm. And that's one of those things where good teams continue to rack up these assets, because not only can they help take your team to the next level, especially a team that's looking to only rush for most of their defensive snaps, but if they hit by the end of their rookie contracts, once they get to the open market, they're going to get super paid. And that's probably putting you in a good spot to recoup a pick for that player. So it's like an investment that yields you 4 great years. Don't overthink it. Get another pick and recycle the timeline. But that's why it's so important to keep drafting to that spot, and doing so maybe once a year, once every 2 years. They just haven't done it, and I think it's really showed to their lack of depth at defensive end, and the fact that they couldn't get any pressure from anyone on the outside that played first and second down outside of Greg Rousseau.
Nobody's going to get it perfect, but I do think that the guys that Beane moved on off of last offseason was really like a masterclass in how to get ahead of declining players, right? Like Tre'Davious White's a great example. Diggs, not so much, although he ended up getting injured, which I think they were on borrowed time there with how healthy he was over the course.
He looked good before that injury, though.
And he did. So yeah. I'll take him out of it. Poyer looked like a shell of himself. Not that he was very good his last year in Buffalo anyway. Yeah. And Mitch Morse was just fine, but that offensive line wasn't great in Jacksonville anyway. And for the money that you were paying, I think the production you got out of McGovern, it was a very forward-thinking move across the board. I think he did a really good job getting out on a lot of things, not paying Gabe Davis. Massive props for that as well. But for all of those really good decisions, there have been some where you just kind of scratch your head a little bit. Like the faith that they put in Daquan Jones coming off of that injury at his age, to me was a huge misstep. It almost like, wouldn't you rather treat Daquan Jones as okay, if he comes in and he is the early 2023 version of himself, like I think about him in that Jacksonville Jaguars game before he got injured in London, he was playing at an elite level. You hope you're getting that version of him on a 2-year contract extension. But I don't think you can bank on that. And I think you have to build around that in the case that he's better served to play the Jordan Phillips role than he is the Daquan Jones role. I look at that, and listen, hindsight's always 20/20. I'm not trying to sit here and say, I'm going to paint this brush the way that it's easy to paint because I could tell the story now how it should have been. But I was screaming this back at the draft last year. I thought the Keon Coleman pick was a little short-sighted because Tavondre Sweat to me was a guy that had a unique skill set. I know he doesn't fit their usual build, but to pair him next to Ed Oliver, to me, would take a lot of pressure off the guy that you need to be the chaos creator in the middle. He was available there for you. You traded down. You didn't necessarily need that receiver. You needed a receiver, but you didn't have to go receiver there. I'm just using that as one example, but I would have rather them prioritize that spot, gone and got a guy, and if he doesn't end up beating out Daquan Jones for that starter role, fine, he can be the backup, and then you don't have to put yourself in the position to go out there and rely on Austin Johnson signing retreads like Jordan Phillips and Quentin Jefferson.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I am not making excuses for them whatsoever, but I think what probably led them to not go after a one-technique defensive tackle in last year's draft is the fact that the Daquan Jones contract was basically a 2-year deal. Like, they're not getting out of that deal this year, and was he as good as 2023? No. Was he above average to just under the point of good back from my film grading this year? Yeah, I think Jones was a bit more misunderstood this season than some other players, and I didn't get the impression that the Bills were all that concerned is a wrong word, but they weren't as panicked about the defensive tackle room as maybe some other positions when they were meeting with the media after the season. Just because Jones, they know that they're eventually going to have to replace him, and I think they will spend a draft pick on a one technique this year because they haven't done it since Harrison Phillips. They also don't want to depend on a rookie one technique defensive tackle to go in and be their starter right away, which is why I think this is probably the year where they take one. I'm looking at, maybe if the right one falls to that second round pick, or with that early 4th round pick, which is basically a third because of how bad the Giants were. I think that would be the ideal spot to go to pair the value of the position with where that draft slot is, and to help fill a future need while potentially getting a future starter out of it. Because let's not forget, Harrison Phillips was taken 96th overall. If that Giants pick at the top of the 4th round ends up 107, what's the difference? Like it's basically the same thing. So that would be the way that I think they probably approach it this year. But they do need better depth behind them, because that one technique spot, if anything did happen to Daquan Jones, goodness me, what would they have done? Like Austin Johnson, he had his moments throughout the year. Like he was fine. But nothing like where you could have a degree of confidence that if Jones goes down, what the heck's going to happen? Past him, Jordan Phillips doesn't play one technique, so that he was just a backup to Ed Oliver. They tried to moonlight Dwayne Carter at one technique a couple of weeks just to see if he might give them a little bit of a spark. And I thought he actually did kind of okay in that role, but they view him as a 3 technique that can slide inside to one technique if they need him to. But still, there was a time this year where they were relying on Zion Logue, and he was just getting pushed around, even though he's a huge body. Right. So they absolutely need to address it. But like I said, I just don't know that they viewed it as big of an issue as maybe a lot of people out there, a lot of fans out there. And it makes me wonder if I'm seeing a lot of defensive tackle to the Bills at 30 in mock drafts early on. And I'm not saying it won't happen. It's just, that's not the initial read that I got on the situation, where if you're looking for higher impact, like wide receiver, defensive end, cornerback, probably your best bet.
I mean, Aleem McNeil is one of the best players at the position in the league right now, and he was a 3rd-round draft pick. I mean, you can get value in all of these rounds. The Bills have 2 second-round picks. Maybe that's where they – and
where is Daquan Jones drafted is my question.
Who?
Where was Daquan?
That's a great – look it up. Look it up. I can see you Googling it.
He was a 4th-round pick in 2014.
Right. So it's very doable to go
pick
out
112.
Pick 112. Wow.
See?
All right. Thank you. I mean, we're just rock and rolling. Almost 40 minutes here, just having a little conversation about the Buffalo Bills here on Shout. Thank you so much for watching. Hit that like button, subscribe on YouTube. We really appreciate your support. So the next piece, one more piece on defense, and then I want to have a quick offensive conversation before we get out of here, is cornerback. And Rasul Douglas is a free agent. I don't think that his number is going to be particularly untenable, but at the same time, I thought, just, as someone that doesn't like crush the film like you do, there was a significant drop off. And I'm not just talking about the lack of turnovers. I'm just talking about, in the big time moments, just him holding up, whether it be in man-to-man coverage, whether it be reaction time. He's getting older. I just don't know if he was as effective of a player. There's a real concern at depth cornerback right now behind Christian Benford with Douglas entering free agency. You have Kyer Elam. You like what you have in Jamarcus Ingram, but I think we both can agree that it might be time to just pull the plug on the Kyer Elam experience in general. How do you feel like the Bills will approach cornerback this offseason? And it's funny, I don't know how much you've watched him, but you think about like Alex Austin a couple of years ago, a late round draft pick that they kind of had that, started a lot of games for the Patriots over the last couple of years. Is it a draft where they maybe try to attack boundary corner multiple times? Do they do some work in free agency, maybe on the fringes? How do you see it happening?
I think there is a definite path to 2 moves at boundary cornerback, maybe 3, depending on if they move Kyer Elam on and just like a change of scenery deal, where it's maybe like you flip a 7th-round pick for a 6th-round pick or something like that. His value is completely tanked now. And back after I bring this up, but leading up to his 3rd season, I put out an article about logical trade candidates back then. And he was number one on my list because his value would never have been higher at that point, because you kind of knew that he was getting outplayed by Christian Benford in-house. You have this guise of Tre'Davious White being there and all of these other things, that was the reason that Kaiir Elam couldn't get on the field. So, but they decided to see it out. And I can't necessarily blame that for them, because they've been patient with other players, i.e. Spencer Brown, and it's gone really well for them. But usually at cornerback, you can kind of tell pretty quickly with these guys. And offensive line is a bit of a different beast. Same thing with the defensive line. Same thing with, wide receiver, even to a lesser degree. Cornerback, you have a pretty good idea. So I thought that was maybe a missed opportunity, and now his value's just tanked. But he's got so much money against the cap that it would be more profitable for them to just do a little late round swap with a team to try and move him on elsewhere. And so someone else can kick the tires on him. If they move him on, I could see them making a couple of moves, maybe 3 moves, depending on how they see Jamarcus Ingram. Rasul Douglas, I could absolutely see being back for a 1-year deal. And Douglas, he was not as good last year as he was the year that they acquired him. Especially in the playoffs. I know that's what's fresh in everybody's mind. I will just remind everyone that they played a lot of man coverage in the divisional round and in the AFC Championship game, and that is not his game. And that is probably a detriment right there, because it takes away some flexibility for you, because what Christian Benford has been able to master over his first 3 seasons. At first, when he got here, he was zone cornerback, instincts. That was his game, and that's why he was so highly thought of. But what he developed this year was the ability to turn and run, the fluid hips, being able to pair man-to-man with these quicker receivers. And that's not something that I think a lot of people thought he could do into his 3rd season. That's why he has taken such a jump. So the fact that you have one guy who's a complete zone guy, the other guy who can do a little bit of both, when they go to man in those dire situations, like I talked about, the guy who's a total zone guy is going to get exposed a bit, and that's Douglas. But that said, like, they're not going to draft someone and automatically throw him on the field. That's just not how they usually operate, unless it's someone they truly believe in, or it was back in 2017 or 2018 when they just said, hey, our starting lineup's wide open. So I would not be surprised if they bring back Rasul Douglas on a 1-year deal. Could probably get him on a pretty cost-effective deal, I would think. He's super tight with Christian Benford. He loved his time in Buffalo. From every time I talked to him, he seemed like a pretty happy guy. I think he could be the potential bridge to whoever they draft. And let's say they take a corner at 56 or 62 or one of those 2 spots. Maybe as the season wears on, kind of like a Cole Bishop sort of deal, if he improves to the point where you can't keep this guy off the field, then he's the person you turn to, improving your depth in the meantime, giving you some special teams reps, but also, knowing that he is the future starter at the spot. And also because you're going to have to pay Christian Benford. That's a guy that, if it's me, I'm not letting him get to free agency. He has the potential to be one of their best defenders for the foreseeable future. And that's not something I would get ahead of an extension right now if I were Brandon Beane. And they have a few decisions they have to make, like Terrell Bernard, Greg Rousseau is coming up. There's another, Khalil Shakir is coming up. But Benford is, to me, number 1, no doubt about it, because how much you could sign him for right now compared to his value to what he's going to give to that defensive secondary, it's just not even a question in my mind. So to me, that kind of lends itself to 1-year stopgap situation, draft a guy, and then have Benford be your number 1, Douglas be with him this year, and then in 2026 have the draft pick come in and be the starter with him.
If we were playing in the Gus Macker tournament, our roles would be, when we were running the pick and roll, you'd be setting the pick and diving to the basket. I'd be throwing it up to you so you can slam it home. In this scenario, though, just now, you threw the alley-oop to me, and I'm going to dunk it down because that's a great transition point. James Cook, to me, is the most interesting extension conversation to have on this team right now. I love what you said about Greg Rousseau and about comparing him to potentially being the Tremaine Edmonds, where you got to have to really think about it, maybe stretch this thing out to the final hour, see what his value is. With Cook, it's so interesting because I think you have a regime with the Bills who obviously values the position probably more than most around the league. I mean, it's been the renaissance of the position, Philly, Baltimore, Henry, and Saquon Barkley. But Brandon Beane was in the mix for Christian McCaffrey a couple years ago, and that was going to be a very costly acquisition. You have James Cook, a guy that I don't think anybody thought when they drafted him, maybe even the Bills, was going to be this version of the player that he was this season. Physical runner, playmaker in the red zone, obviously still brings you the speed and elusiveness. An extension is probably going to get a little bit pricey. And the backdrop to this offseason conversation around Cook is this is probably the most stocked draft at running back in years. And so I think wherever you want to go, you could probably throw a couple darts with potentially 10 picks at running back, see what you have and invest in a guy that way. Or you pay James Cook and lock him up long-term, but maybe at the detriment of this cap situation. And, you know, with a lot of skeletons in the closet, one being Dawson Knox. What do you think here? How do you feel like they're approaching that James Cook conversation? Or is it something where you're like, listen, let's let him go through this season, see where we're at after this year. We don't want to make that decision yet.
I could see them paying him just because of how important he was this past year in terms of their early down stuff. But I do think there is a bit of not fool's gold, but I wonder how sustainable this is year over year for him, because let's not forget, best offensive line the Bills have ever had under Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane. Not even close. And they're going to have that same offensive line next year, as long as nobody gets injured. After that, questions start to arise with contracts expiring, extensions, Deion Dawkins getting up there in age, this, that, and the other. I will just point to one thing when it talks about the James Cook extension. I often think that the way that teams use players gives you a very stark window into how they view that player. And they can say how important this person is to their team and everything else. But when you have James Cook, who when he is active in games, played only 47.5% of snaps, that to me is like, how much you paying him? And is it worth it? Now, the counter to this is, do they think James Cook can eventually become that 3-down guy and they move on from Ty Johnson and allow James Cook to be first, second, and third down and an obvious passing situations? But it's almost as though the viewpoint of Cook has flipped a bit inside the building, because even Sean McDermott, when he was asked about it, said we drafted him to be a pass catching back. I think I was listening to JJ Zacharyson a little bit earlier today, and he was talking about James Cook, and I think he had like an 8% target rate. Like that's not that great for a pass catching back. And he's only on first and second downs for the most part, you know, occasionally third downs when it's third and short above all else. But it was to me, even though James Cook had all of these touchdowns, just a ridiculous touchdown year for him, all of these different touchdowns. But at the end of the day, it was still a 1A, 1B situation with him and Ty Johnson, if we're being completely honest about it. Ty Johnson, his snaps in games that he was active, 30.9%. It was Cook 47.5, Johnson 30.9, and then Ray Davis kind of filling in the rest. So if he gets over 10, 12, 13, $14 million at that point, if it's me, and I know how much more important running backs have become this past year, because it's been the NFL's overall pivot to attacking cover 2 shell and everything like that. But when you have this, when you have a player that you are not putting out there for 55, 60, 65, 70% of snaps, how much is that really worth to the organization? And how replaceable is that when there's a lot of guys who can come in and, like you said, this is a strong running back class, and try and figure it out from there. And not to mention, you have Ray Davis on the roster, and he looked pretty good in those enhanced opportunities. So that's something that's definitely in the back of my mind. But like I said, I could see them doing it because of how Cook has developed, and usually they don't like to let those guys out of the building.
How much do you think this is a conversation that happens inside the building, like when they're crunching down the cap situation, where they maybe start to put two potential extensions next to each other and saying, what do we value more? So say if we give James Cook an extension that pays him $11 million per season or whatever that number ends up being, versus an approaching window for O'Cyrus Torrence, who's going to probably get paid top interior offensive lineman money when he comes up, especially if he takes another step next season. Is it one of those things where you think inside the building, some of the front office folks are like, I don't think we could give Cook an extension because we're going to have to pay this much for Torrance, and we're already on the hook for the tackles and so on and so forth?
Yeah, you have to be really careful in paying non-premium positions because that's how your cap sheet can get boosted up in a hurry. And I think that's what we wound up seeing with the Edmonds thing, just because they already paid Matt Milano. Now, flip that around. Back when that was going, I thought it was probably in their better interest to give Edmonds a chance rather than re-signing Milano. But seeing what Edmonds wound up getting, I understand the decision to move on. Cook is a non-premium position. O'Cyrus Torrence at guard, non-premium position. O'Cyrus Torrence wasn't even the best guard on the team last year. It was David Edwards. It wasn't close. Edwards was awesome last season. O'Cyrus Torrence got better as the season went on, and he was definitely at his best in the second half and in the playoffs. But David Edwards was their best guard. So to me, and where did they pick up David Edwards from? They gave him a 1-year prove-it deal, transition that into a 2-year contract after he played their 6th offensive lineman. You can find guards. You don't have to pay guards unless they are top of the top. And this is what I'm talking about in not using your precious cap resources when you are paying a franchise quarterback, which, by the way, they're going to have to re-up him pretty soon here because he's underpaid. Considering the rest of the NFL environment right now and the fact that Sam Darnold's probably going to get more than Josh Allen, which is hilarious. Yeah. But you have to be careful with these different positions that you choose to pay. Like tight end is another great example. If we talked about Dawson Knox contract earlier, is that something that they really needed to give a premium contract to? No. Cornerback, number one cornerback, absolutely super important within the scheme of their offense. Defensive end, when you find the guy, you pay the guy. No doubt about it. 3 technique defensive tackle, when you find the guy, you pay the guy because he's so important to their scheme. Quarterback, absolutely. Wide receiver, when you find the guy, pay the guy because he can take your team to the next level. Everything else, kind of replaceable if we're being honest. Linebacker, running back, guard, center's another one. Center, offensive tackle. Those are the 2 that I forgot. Those are the ones that I think you want to invest in, and they have done that. But you just have to be really careful. That's why when we're talking about extension candidates, Christian Benford is number 1, no doubt about it, because of how much you could get him for right now. Cornerback market being what it is, no one really knows about him just yet, and I think they're going to know about him. I think it's like a Spencer Brown situation where he could just absolutely take a huge leap forward in 2025. So if I'm the Bills, I would want to get ahead of that. Rousseau is probably number 2 on that list for me, and then it's Shakir, and then figure it out between Bernard and Cook.
What's the Shakir contract look like to you?
A little bit more than Samuel, I would think. I mean, he does, statistically speaking, not like a Hellraiser. If we're like he's just
right.
He had under 850 yards, but he's important to them. And I think that how they're going to approach the wide receiver position unless they trade for one, which I'm not super expecting, but the Garrett Wilson conversation is kind of interesting if he ever becomes available, which I don't think he is now that they're probably moving on from Rodgers and probably Devontae Adams along with
What
him.
about Chris Olave?
I love Chris Olave, but I don't think the Saints are going to be in a position to move him either.
Right.
Because Kellen Moore is going to look at him and go, okay, give me him plus another receiver potentially, and however much Kamara has left, and go for it. Because I think they're probably going to draft a receiver, and my guess is this year within the first couple of rounds, having a couple of guys on rookie deals in Coleman and whoever this other draft pick might be would allow them to pay a Shakir. So I don't think that, like, that percentage of cap that you would assign to the wide receiver position, I think could just become Shakir as opposed to, trying to not sign Shakir to a long-term deal because you already have a number one in a Diggs or something like that. So that kind of opens that gateway, which is why I have him third. But the Bernard conversation and the James Cook conversation are so interesting to me. And if they wind up passing on Greg Rousseau, it's probably going to be because they'll re-up one of Bernard or Cook, maybe both. But I don't think they can have it all here. I think they're going to have to pick 3, maybe 4 if you move on from Rousseau. But the no doubter for me is Benford, and everything else is negotiable.
All right, I want to get you out of here, but I want to have one little mini conversation before we do.
What is it about?
Sean McDermott.
Okay.
And, we've had this conversation amongst ourselves at practice and, in the press box and throughout the season. It's just, I feel like the outside noise around McDermott's comfort level, where the temperature of his seat, if you will, seems to not be in lockstep with how he's viewed in the building. And I wonder, from your perspective, what would I get asked this question a lot, and I'd be interested to hear your take on it, and we could talk about it. What would have to happen in 2025 for the Bills to move off of McDermott?
I don't think it's happening.
No, there's no situation.
I mean, unless it completely bottoms out and Josh Allen claims that it's either me or him, which he loves Sean. Like he is so in favor of Sean McDermott. Everybody in that building loves Sean McDermott. He's come a long way over the years. I mean, I remember how he approached just very little things early on in his regime in the Bills to what he is now. Like, it's a night and day approach. He went from super micromanager to he's kind of playing it cool, being a macromanager, still putting his voice in when it needs to, but allowing the building to kind of run itself. And he's come a long way in terms of in-game management too. Like, the one game that I think he really cost them was the Rams game.
Right.
Outside of that, there aren't many decisions where it's like, whoa, what was Sean thinking there? He's gotten better in that capacity. Fourth down stuff, like, he goes for it all the time. Like in the AFC Championship game when the Chiefs got a penalty and they put him to the 1 and they're like, well, we're going for 2. Perfect. Great. That's exactly what you want from your head coach, to have that knowledge of saying, okay, this is what the math says, and go, okay, let's play the odds here and hope that they're in our favor. And that's what you want out of the coach. I don't think, especially, and this is a bigger point, but they've got a new facility about to unveil in 2026. I do not think they're going to go into 2026 with an unknown about this team. They have a head coach who has made it to the playoffs in 7 of his 8 years. How many? 9, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 6 in a row. He's made it to the divisional round the last 5 years. 2 of those years, he's made it to the AFC Championship game. They lost by 3 points to the Chiefs to get to the Super Bowl this past year. They are making strides. No, I mean, I understand the frustration about finally wanting to get there, But I do think that it's a lot of a bigger conversation, and also luck is kind of involved too. It's a lot bigger of a conversation than just, oh, get the head coach out of here and figure out someone who would do it, because you also have to kind of start from the bottom level when you replace head coach, because the entire structure of the organization changes from that point forward. So if they get to a point where they have lost their first playoff game for several years in a row, then I think maybe if they miss the playoffs for several years in a row, or 2 or 3 years in a row, you're like, okay, maybe it's time. Maybe the message has gone stale. I don't think the message has gone stale in the building. So, and I get that question a lot too. My usual response is, don't waste your brain space on it, honestly, because it's not changing. And the only way it changes is if there is a massive gulf between the head coach and the GM, the head coach and the owner, the head coach and the quarterback. But that's not coming anytime soon, because Sean McDermott is universally well-liked throughout the building by just about everybody there.
I thought it was interesting at the end at his season-ending press conference when I asked him about Matthew Smiley, if he was confident that he was coming back. He said yes. Mm-hmm. And 2 weeks later, he fired Matthew Smiley, and he's bringing in what I think a lot of people would consider a top-tier special teams coordinator, Chris Tabor. They weren't, when I first saw Carolina Panthers, I was kind of like, seriously?
Here we go.
they didn't overlap in Carolina.
No,
so
not even close.
Right. Not even close. So that's not really a piece of this, but I do think that's a piece of what you're talking about. Like the evolution of Sean McDermott, maybe having to put aside, the emotional piece, the personal piece. Like Matthew Smiley's been on his staff since 2017, right? Ken Dorsey was another example of that, having to move on from him in the middle of the season. Like those are tough decisions that elite head coaches have to make. Like the special teams unit wasn't good enough last year. I don't know how you could go into next year with Matthew Smiley as the special teams coordinator again, with the lack of, and listen, they use the excuse of, like we moved on from a lot of veterans, captains, people that had been special teams regulars. Newsflash, in 2023, they weren't that good on special teams anyway, even with those guys. So they needed a new vision here. And I think it's commendable that Sean moved off of that as quickly as he did and put themselves in a position. And maybe it was doing a little due diligence and reaching out to his camp and seeing if Tabor, who was out of the NFL last year, wanted to come back to coaching. Maybe you didn't want to make that move unless the person that you wanted to replace him with, you thought you had a chance to get him.
That's the perfect point right there, because Smiley, to them, they trust him, and they couldn't just replace him with just anybody. Like they couldn't replace him and move on to the assistant special teams coordinator. Right. Like they couldn't go and go with a young guy from somewhere else across the league. Like the only ways for them to, well, I suppose they could have done it no matter what, but because Smiley meant a lot to the organization and everything along those lines, and his development throughout the years, they didn't want to just do it unless they knew that they had somebody good. And like Darren Rizzi would have been someone that's interesting, but he quickly went back with Sean Payton from what reports are saying. And then Chris Tabor, who seems like a good hire from how his special teams units have played over the years. That's the only way that, like, the evolution of that, seeing that, okay, there is something out there that is better than what we have had, and it could give our team a boost, even if it means that we're going to have to move on from somebody that we care about, which is what they kind of did last offseason with a bunch of the veterans that they let go too. Then if it's in the better interest of the organization, then you do it. And so they did it. So I agree with you. I think McDermott said what he said at the end of the news conference because, at that point he didn't have a concrete plan. And if they didn't get someone that they were really jazzed up about, then put another year into Matthew Smiley's development. And because they liked him enough to keep him in that role for a few years. Mm-hmm. So I understand why they handled it the way that they did, even though it wasn't like the immediate gratification that I think fans probably wanted. And I thought he should have been gone too, mind you. But I understand why they approached it the way that they did.
Valentine's Day is coming up in 2 days. This show is going up on Wednesday. You can get to Tops Friendly Markets right now and stock up for the special loved one in your life. Russell Stover Valentine's Day candy platters are available. Birthday cake pops. Prepare the perfect meal for your Valentine with premium Tops beef, lobster tails, shrimp deals, and then, of course, get yourself a signature dozen rose bouquet, $29.99 each at Tops Friendly Markets. Who officially and proudly brings you Shout, a Buffalo Bills football podcast. Before we get out of here, Joe, let everybody know what you got cooking over the next couple of weeks, and I will see you in Indy, my friend.
Well, what posted today was my first of the season Bills mock draft. So that's
spicy.
Fun. I'm surprised that you didn't check up on me beforehand. We could have gotten to some of the names, but that opportunity is now gone, Matt Parrino.
Listen, dude, we're recording here, man. You might have just opened up a really bad wormhole. No, I'm just kidding. We'll go to The Athletic, read Joe's mock draft. I'm surprised that was not on my radar because I usually don't. Do you usually put a mock draft out this early?
Bill's only one, yeah.
Okay.
Just to kind of dip the toes in the water, so to speak. I do a bunch of research and figure out types that Bills might like, and then once this weekend's, then I'll really start hitting the film and if one of those guys are like, oh, maybe that's not a fit after all, then I'll be like, yeah, I was wrong there. But yeah, it's a good exercise and to see strategy, how they could do it, where values are in certain points of the draft, everything along those lines. So yeah, that's up there. And then I'll have a few other things before the NFL Combine. One very fun thing that I love to do every single year.
Sweet. Very, very cool stuff. Thank you so much for being so gracious with your time. Joe Buscaglia, find all of his work at The Athletic. We will be back after I return from Disney World. So it's going to be a little bit of a break on Shout, but when I get back, it'll be full systems go to the Combine, to the draft, everything Buffalo Bills offseason as we creep our way towards free agency. Thanks a lot, Joe. See you later, buddy.